Hitler famously said, I have a Nazi Luftwaffe, I have a Prussian army, and I have an imperial navy. And he comes out of that tradition.
Leaving aside Dunkirk, this is the only opportunity I see. And let's face it, we're talking about a window of opportunity that was fairly narrow in size, okay, and it slammed shut at some point in July of 1941.
You've got the French in Syria, you're going to have an agreement that obviously both sides need to have their interests safeguarded. I would think the French are looking on saying, well, it happened to us, we're glad it's happened to the British now.
If you literally have the Afrika Korps or even Panzerarmee Afrika, as it might well have been by then, occupying Baku, then I literally don't see the Soviet Union winning this one. I really don't.
Yeah,
the entire war.
Oh yeah,
the entire war.
Game over.
It's literally game over.
Towards the end of 1940, Adolf Hitler was at something of a crossroads. His war machine is in near total control of Western Europe, but the Luftwaffe had failed to break British resolve or the RAF to the other side of the Channel. Now Germany was looking for a new front in a different direction. For some in Nazi high command, the choice was clear. Push south to the British Empire's Mediterranean network, take Gibraltar and the Suez Canal before moving to the Middle East and its oil fields. Yet that didn't happen, and by 1941, Hitler's ideology won out with the launch of Operation Barbarossa. Of course, the invasion of the Soviet Union was a failure. But what if Admiral Raeder got his way and Germany had taken the Mediterranean option? I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode, we focus on a different military campaign or a tide of history, and with the help of our experts, we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today, it's Adolf Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union rather than push south to the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Barbarossa unquestionably changed the Second World War, so what effect could a different strategy have had on Germany, the Soviet Union, and the end result? These are, of course, questions for our experts, and joining me today, as ever, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and returning to the channel once again is the senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy, Dr. Klaus Schmider. Welcome to you both, gentlemen. Now, we have in front of us our favourite map of Europe from 1940. Just going to talk about a few things that we'll be discussing in this episode. Of course, as I mentioned, in 1941, we see the invasion, Operation Barbarossa, to Germany's east. But a few things we're going to be talking about in this episode. Let's talk about Spain, down here, Gibraltar, the tip of North Africa, and the Suez Canal in Egypt. Chris, always a pleasure to have you by my side. Now, this plan that wasn't followed through, it's fair to say that Admiral Raeder is the one that is spearheading this. Can you just tell us a little bit about Raeder, the man?
So Raeder is head of the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. He's been in post since 1928. He was the Chief of Staff to Franz Hipper, the head of the scouting force at the Battle of Jutland. He's only ever commanded a ship for 10 months, and he narrowly avoided having to surrender his cruiser at Scapa Flow back in the end of the First World War. But he's an academic. He's written a notable series of books on what he calls Handelskrieg, which is basically trade warfare. He's got a global view of how navies should be used. He's straight out of the imperial tradition, the Tirpitz tradition in that sense. He believes in big ships. And of course, because Germany was stopped having submarines at the Treaty of Versailles, the big ship navy is a very big lobby in the German Navy throughout that time. He oversees the rebuilding of the German Navy after the Treaty of Versailles. It's a small navy, unfortunately, but he encourages his people to look at new tactics. That's the first thing. And when Hitler comes to power in 1933, he has an agreement with him. He says, look, if you can keep the party out of the navy, I'll keep the navy out of politics. And that's something that's very sensitive in Hitler's mind, given the mutinies, of course, at the end of the First World War. And they both actually, by and large, stick to that agreement. Now, the problem is that Raeder is a control freak. There's no question about that. And Germany has some very talented admirals at the start of World War II, and he sacks two very good operational commanders, Böhm and Marshall, and he gets Admiral Lütjens, who subsequently dies in the Bismarck, very talented operational commander, in as an operational commander. Now, the Siegkriegsleitung, the operational staff, comes up with a plan in 1940. And there's a bit of inter-service rivalry here, as well as trying to put Hitler off going to Russia, which is in the air at the time.
So he's already sort of talking about that and considering that. Okay.
And certainly after the fall of France, the Navy starts pushing this plan by Gerhard Wagner through Raeder, saying, look, there is another option here. You don't actually have to go to Russia directly in order to defeat Britain. We think we can defeat Britain by cutting its arteries through the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal to India and beyond. And there are a lot of other options as well if we go down that route. And we can explore those in a minute. And Hitler listens. He actually listens and he says, well, you know, we've got other things going on at the moment. Meanwhile, I mean, if you listen to Admiral Raeder's comments after the war, he said, well, the army were dead set on Hitler's plan to go east. Yeah. And the Luftwaffe, he says, well, they always did what they wanted anyway. So there is a lot of inter-service rivalry here. But strategically, Raeder is saying, look, this is entirely consistent with what I call a global vision for Germany. And he complains about the Army's continental obsession when he said we need to be dealing with a global maritime vision for the future.
And Klaus, welcome back to History Undone. Absolute pleasure to have you again. We need to be thinking about a global plan, as Chris says there. What is Raeder's plan?
Well, Raeder's plan is nothing if not ambitious. He wants to get into Libya, into Egypt and beyond. Then he would like Gibraltar, because he feels that once Gibraltar's gone, the Italian surface navy, which is in numbers much more impressive than the German one, might actually sally forth into the open Atlantic. On top of that, even though these two schemes at some point then get separated, he also has ideas about hoovering up not just the Spanish Canary Islands, which it's just about doable. They're not too far away from the nearest mainland. So you can have land-based air cover for whatever you might get busy there. He also wants the Cape Verdes and the Azores, which frankly is a fantasy. And I'm not quite sure, and again, Admiral Parry might have a clearer idea here than me, whether he actually truly believed this to be viable. It's an idea which pops up time and again. I'm personally almost inclined to see in this as something he's willing to, shall we say, negotiate away.
Of course.
Should there be pushback?
I mean, I think on that, Klaus, one of the things he's always saying at this stage is we're going to have to take on America at some stage, Mein Führer. So if we're going to do that, we're going to need these islands in the Atlantic, and we need the Italians out there as well. So again, thinking in maritime terms, Raeder's way down the track. And we know that Hitler had views that after he dealt with Russia and Britain, they might have to take on the United States as well. And all through 40, 41, of course, the Americans are giving aid to Britain across the Atlantic. So all this is sort of relevant. But what I think we have to do, and Klaus has hinted at this, is you're constantly giving cues to Hitler so he has the good idea. And I think a lot of this is throwing stuff into the pot to say, look, you know, this is a really good idea.
Trying to get his ear.
Yeah, we've seen stuff that you've written. Maybe you want to actually do something about this. But Raeder constantly, I mean, Raeder, of course, is the one who says, let's go into Norway. We can use Trondheim as a huge Atlantic base. And indeed, the Germans start building it up as a huge Atlantic base. So Raeder's full of good ideas. And indeed, one of the things at Nuremberg, for which he's charged, of course, is for planning to wage aggressive war. And a lot of the evidence used for that is things like this, where they say, look, you had all these plans in Norway, in here, in Denmark, everything like that in the Atlantic. You're the one.
There's a few problems with this plan. We've mentioned Adolf Hitler is one of them. We'll get to a couple in a second. Klaus talked about how kind of ambitious this is. We know they did carry through with Operation Barbarossa. A few things more ambitious than trying to invade the Soviet Union. But this is still, a huge area, and we haven't even got to the Middle East yet. Do they fundamentally have the resources, Klaus, to do this?
They do.
They do?
They do. There's just one big obstacle in the way. No, one very big obstacle and a medium-sized obstacle. The big obstacle is, of course, the Royal Navy, which is based here and there.
And here.
And
in Malta.
And there is, of course, the force which the British are building in Egypt, which is not large, but it includes some very high-quality mechanized forces, arguably the most up-to-date, the best trained mechanized forces the United Kingdom can field at the time, because frankly the Prime Minister took a bit of a gamble in August when he parted with more than 200 tanks to pass on to the Middle East, and this in the face of, don't know about probable, but certainly possible invasion crossing the Channel. So in my humble opinion, this is easily the most reckless gamble the Prime Minister takes in the entire war. And he's given an awful lot of stick, often unfairly, over a number of things. To me, this is the big one. Yeah. So and that's why the British actually have a force to be reckoned with in Egypt. That's not something you could simply ignore.
Yeah, you agree with that, Chris?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this plan really comes to the fore when Sea Lion is being thought about and being planned. In fact, Lutyens himself is in command of the operation. But Raeder, in the conferences, you can tell, is saying, I really don't like the idea of Sea Lion. You know, our Navy's been absolutely destroyed in Norway. We've got one operational U-boat. All our destroyers are gone. Don't fancy this at all. And you can almost sense between Lutyens and Raeder that they're saying, well, just do what we have to do, but this isn't happening. And that's when this Mediterranean plan comes out. Now, what's interesting is you've got a number of players here, and Klaus has said there's a medium-sized obstacle. The first is Italy. We've got to remember, Italy doesn't come into the war until France has fallen. That's the first thing. And the Italians believe that this is their lake, Mare Nostrum. And there are constant resistances to Hitler saying, look, we need a unified command down here in the Mediterranean. And right up until the end of 1941, the Italians absolutely refused to have a unified command. And they think they have primacy in terms of the Navy. We've mentioned Spain.
And they have a very strong Navy. You've spoken about this before.
If you look at the Italian Navy, their ships are incredible, as they are today. They're incredibly well built. They're very capable, but they're not well manned and they're not well commanded. And of course, Admiral Cunningham and Admiral Somerville in the Mediterranean spend a lot of time dealing with the Italian Navy. They've taken a bit of a hit, of course, at Taranto. Have been attacked by carrier aviation. And they don't put out a great showing. They're very timid in many ways. And they're actually based to the north as well, out of range of what they think are torpedo aircraft and also aircraft from Malta. So Italy's a bit of a problem because every time Hitler says, look, I really want to get involved here, Mussolini says, well, it's our part of ship, actually. Can we? And he respects that. And it's only when as Klaus said, it's only when the Italians say, we're not doing very well in North Africa, could you please send the Africa Corps? And that's in February 1941, that the Germans start to get some sort of traction. But as we'll see through the rest of the year, the Germans are constantly having to reinforce the Italians because they're not doing very well, to the extent that, even while they're engaged on the Eastern Front, they have to send Flieger Corps 2, a whole air group down to help the Italians and also to help in North Africa. So it's a real sideshow. There are two other players. Spain, we've already mentioned. Hitler tries to get Spain on board and the Spanish say, look, we'll help you, but we're not having any German bases here. We want our military modernised and we want food aid. And Hitler says, I'm not having any of that. And so that doesn't happen.
Because Spain has just come out of a civil war as well.
And they need to recover. And also, Franco's quite smart. He's thinking, I don't really know how this is going to go in the war. So overland route to Gibraltar isn't great. The other player here is Turkey. Now, Turkey, at the start of the war, is concerned about Russia. And so has an alliance, basically, with Britain and France. On the fall of France, they think, oh, that's not going to be any good to us anymore. So they then basically have a neutrality provision. They then have a non-aggression pact with Germany just before Barbarossa, which is fairly spooky, and they sit on the fence. But under their İnönü, who is the successor to Ataturk, they are defiantly neutral. They want to stay neutral, and the Germans know that. The other thing that the Germans get from Turkey is all their chromium. So they want to keep the chromium coming for armaments and things like that. They don't want to upset that particular trade.
So, Klaus, everything that Chris has analysed there, what are kind of the main points for why this plan is never put into action? Is it because to get Franco on side, that's key for Gibraltar?
Yeah.
And that comes first?
Well, you could say that the victory in the West almost is too much of a good thing. Everybody everybody in Berlin ends up in a state of shell shock, as in, my God, surely can't be as easy as this. And then they really squander a number of months, you could say, pondering different strategic options. The Spanish, for instance, in July, right after the fall of France, are actually mad keen to get in on the war. Now, the problem with getting Spain into the war is that they want a slice of the pie of the North African French Empire. And the Germans are terrified, quite rightly, that if they indulge the Spanish in this way, the entire French colonial empire, plus a large part of the navy, might just go over to de Gaulle, which is a real possibility. So it is felt that we've got to exercise some caution. So do you want to do this with the Spanish? Do you want some help from the Vichy French? Or do you do the logical thing and do it with the assistance of Italy? Each of these comes with its own set of diplomatic problems. And you could, of course, say, forget it. Okay? I mean, Jesus, you're the head of the Third Reich. Things like accountability don't exactly apply to you. And if the Spanish, say in July, are knocking on your door to be allowed in, well, why not just tell them, yep, we'll be on the road to Gibraltar with you guys by next Wednesday. And if the French have a problem with that, well, we'll see. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. I mean, you can do anything you bloody well want.
Well, of course, the other thing is, it was trying to get the Vichy French on side.
Yes.
And saying, well, actually, we can get most of North Africa here. We can actually neutralise Gibraltar from the other side of the Straits if we want to. So there are all sorts, as Klaus says, there's lots of options here. But, of course, Hitler's very nervous of actually upsetting the arrangement with the Vichy French this early in the relationship. It doesn't become exploitative fully until much later. They've already seen the French fleet partly destroyed there. The other one's immobilised here in Alexandria. We've still got quite a lot of stuff here in the south of France, so that's available. That gets sunk later and disabled, but that's still available. So getting the Vichy French on side actually would be very good indeed. And of course, that would help them when they get around here in Palestine and Syria as well. That's the key point.
Well, we're going to head to the Middle East in just a second. Just on the Italian and Mussolini front, obviously after they decide to go to Barbarossa, the Germans, and this becomes kind of a secondary objective, we know, as you've mentioned, Mussolini gets into quite a lot of trouble in Greece and North Africa. But if instead they do carry through with this plan and get the Italians on side earlier, presumably, that trouble doesn't happen and it's a more coordinated
Earlier
effort?
as in how early?
Beginning of 1941?
No, well, the Africa Corps only deploys in February 41, of course.
So you could have, the first elements of the Africa Corps, the very first elements, are in place by, say, mid-February 1941. And you could have done this 3.5, maybe even 4 months sooner. The problem is, if you do that, you're going to run into a concentration of British power here. They have got some of their best mechanized units, as luck would have it, concentrated, primed and ready to go to tear into Italian Libya. So
It's worth remembering, later in the year, Cunningham and Ritchie actually drive Rommel back from Tobruk right to his starting line, and that's even before they build up for Al Alamein and things like that.
So it could have been, it would have been a head-on clash. It might even have ended in a German victory, but a fairly costly one. And not necessarily the sort of victory which would then, in a second phase, carry you all the way to Cairo.
Exactly.
I think the issue, Fergus, is not so much the land campaign, oddly enough. It's actually neutralising the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean. Because if you neutralise the Navy in the Mediterranean, you can do what you like. And one of the biggest problems for the Africa Corps later, of course, is the interdiction of all Rommel's supplies, mainly with aircraft and submarines from Malta. So if you sweep the seas of the Royal Navy and neutralise that, all options are then open to you. But that means bringing the Italian Navy on side, maybe some of the Vichy French, and that's that and the other. And the other big problem you've got is most of the Italian merchant marine on which you're going to rely was outside the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
So you only got a third of what they had before the war. It can't get in because the British are holding Gibraltar. But my sense, and I think this is what the Sea Kriegsleitung, the operational staff, wanted to do, is actually clear the Royal Navy out. That would have been the first thing. Then you get to do what you like here. You can't directly resupply your troops here, except round the Cape, of course. You've got all sorts of problems.
And there's a whole lot of caveats in here, what we just said.
The biggest caveat with regards to the French, and don't get me wrong, in terms of military potential, they've got far more to offer than Italy, never mind Spain. But for the French to become an active Axis belligerent, you would have had to give them like a really, really sweet deal, by which I mean a proper peace treaty with guarantees, gradual withdrawal of occupying forces, probably even the return, or maybe not of Alsace-Lorraine, but definitely Lorraine, which is really a French province as opposed to Alsace. And there isn't an atom of evidence that anyone in Berlin, and certainly not the head honcho, would have agreed to something like that. Deep down, he always mistrusts the French.
And bear in mind, everybody's thinking about Barbarossa. The real show in town is Barbarossa. So you're saying, OK, we'll just listen to the Navy, just keep them sweet, all that sort of thing. But let's face it, we're just about to launch 170 divisions eastward, and this sideshow here. And remember, Hitler is not a sea creature. Everybody says, every time he goes to sea, he gets seasick. Goering as well was notoriously seasick. The Navy used to call Goering the thrower.
He doesn't listen to Raeder. No.
He used to call Goering the thrower up in chief, much to his annoyance. So he's not sea-minded. And one of the big complaints from Raeder, with all his strategic sort of insight, is, I just can't get through to these guys. They are so land-centric. It's unbelievable.
Well, I have a problem, if I could just chime in.
Please.
Is that Erich Raeder, and I agree with everything Admiral Parry just said, but there's another dimension to this, is that he was, I was going to say borderline, but I'm just going to say useless as a political operator.
That's very frank.
Okay? I mean, to begin with, he is the service chief of the Navy, and which is the one service which has the least political leverage in the Third Reich anyway. In order to make the most of that leverage, you need to be a really cunning political operator, as Karl Dönitz turned out to be. Yeah. And Erich Raeder is pretty much useless.
Well, he's old school. Hitler famously said, I have a Nazi Luftwaffe, I have a Prussian army, and I have an imperial navy. And he comes out of that tradition. And Raeder's attitude to Hitler is a really interesting one. Hitler famously has his senior officers to lunch afterwards. Raeder never goes to lunch. At the end of a briefing, he packs up his file and goes away. And as Klaus said, Dönitz is right in there, and which is why Dönitz is designated as Hitler's successor after the war. And it is quite extraordinary how different it is. But I think we have to understand that Raeder comes from a different generation to Hitler in many ways, and the thinking is different. He always wears an imperial dirk, not a Nazi dirk on his uniform. So there's all sorts of cultural issues associated with that as well.
Well, the plan, as we've just discussed, ambitious, definitely, unlikely, very possibly. But now let's move to the Middle East and some of the areas that the Germans might have looked to control if they'd carried through with this plan. OK, we've got a new map in front of us now showing the entirety of the Middle East. I know Klaus especially is a fan of this. So let's just say in a perfect world, despite everything we've just said in the previous section, in the perfect world, they follow through with this plan, it's going well. Klaus, what are their options? We know Rommel is already in North Africa over here. What are their options for the next stage?
Well, the crucial thing is that you acquire this piece of real estate. And why is that? Because...
And that is the tip, for our audio listeners, that's the sort of tip of the Suez Canal.
Yeah, this is the
Nile Delta.
It's the Nile Delta. The Nile Delta doesn't just give you Cairo. It gives you Alexandria, it gives you Suez, and it gives you Port Said. To give you a general idea, until you get to Alexandria, you depend on a logistical tail that... majority of cases, in turn, feeds from Tripoli harbour. And at no point in time, the Royal Air Force permitting, can you berth more than 4 medium-sized ships in Tripoli on a good day. In the case of Tobruk, just one, not a very large one like that. For the British, just for the routine logistics, possession of Alexandria, Port Said and Suez allows them to have like at least 50 berths for medium-sized ships on any given day. Once you have possession of this area here, that means you've got like the best logistical center you could possibly dream of in order to logistically support a second phase operation into the wider Middle East.
Yeah. And from a purely like geographical standpoint, I'm not saying it was ever close. One of our first episodes, Chris, you and I did El Alamein a few years ago now. I mean, from a geographical perspective, they get close-ish. El Alameins are just about here, is it?
Yeah,
just
they
off
get
the map?
close later on, yeah. I mean, it's a different situation, of course, in those circumstances. You've seen the impact of increased air power at that stage. It's entirely possible that could have happened. It would have taken quite a lot of breakdown. I mean, the implications of actually taking the Nile Delta, of course, are huge because, as Klaus says, it gives you a lot of options into projection, but also stops the British reinforcing up the Red Sea, of course. And I think one thing we have to bear in mind is what's happening with regard to Russia and the Soviet Union at this point. Because if you're getting into this area here, if you're helping out the Italians in the Balkans and things like that, what is the Soviet Union thinking? This is looking just a little bit threatening and actually bears out possibly the paranoia that I'm feeling that he's going to attack. So what do the Soviet Union do at this stage? Well, Klaus and I discussed this just now. You're looking at the Caucasus here, which is where the major oil fields around Baku are, of course. And that's pretty desirable from an economic point of view. So you might imagine a sweep round to here initially. They'll also make overtures to Turkey. Turkey, of course, on the German side in World War I, are staying defiantly neutral. But their position does change. They've got a non-aggression pact in place from June 1941 when this campaign might have taken place. But the big question we've got to ask ourselves, if you are sitting here in the Nile Delta, what effect does that have on Barbarossa happening? What does the German High Command do at this stage? Because it's totally changed the strategic situation.
Surely you can't do both. Or once you've secured down here, then
in my humble opinion, there was a window of opportunity in May, June 1941. Not beyond that, okay? But May, June 1941, there was a genuine window of opportunity. You can have your cake and eat it too.
And if they pursue with what Chris just said, going towards the Caucasus here, I mean, that is a mini Barbarossa, isn't it? I mean,
But how much do you divert from Barbarossa to make this happen? I mean, this is a pretty hostile country. You haven't got the sort of railways and things that you want. I mean, as we know, the geography of Iran is not great. My sense is there will be real pressure on Turkey to allow transit across Turkey here through Anatolia and to get up to here. But you're also thinking to yourself, do we want to provoke the Soviets at this stage? Because looking at the map, it's obviously threatening, and it is a short route up into Russia. There's no question about that. So you've got to really play your cards close to your chest. My sense, bear in mind, let's remember that Barbarossa was initiated to put pressure on Britain to surrender initially. So you're going to put a lot of pressure on Britain by consolidating the whole of this region here, including Cyprus as well, and holding this for a while. You let the Soviets think what they want at this stage, but you don't immediately go for the oil fields. No. That's the point. But Klaus, how does it affect Barbarossa, do we think?
How does it affect Barbarossa? You're quite right. Certainly once you go beyond the Sinai Peninsula, there's bound to be a Soviet reaction of some kind. Don't get me wrong. I mean, we're talking about two scorpions in the same bottle. They're still allies.
Actually, so yeah, reaction. I wanted to push you on that.
Yeah.
This isn't a invasion. We're not talking like an actual Barbarossa, but as Chris said, certainly aggressive. Does the non-aggression pact still hold between?
Well, that depends. Are you going? When are you actually invading? Let's just assume that the German eruption into the Middle East occurs, into the wider Middle East, occurs around mid-June, then frankly, there's only going to be 1 week of diplomatic crises between the two allies before they turn into enemies anyway.
I mean, there's an issue here. Hitler might actually think, OK, let's go for it. We're going to do Barbarossa anyway. So if we hack off the Soviets, it really doesn't matter because we're about to smash them in the East, which is what I want anyway. Yeah. So I think, Klaus, I think they probably go fairly slowly here, but consolidating as they go, giving themselves the option, of course, of the Caucasus. And at the same time, I think Barbarossa goes ahead.
What is likely to happen, however, is that within a couple of weeks of Barbarossa crossing the Polish border, you get a situation where the Soviets are almost certainly going to detach a corps or two to in turn cross the border into Iran.
Yeah.
And possibly as far as Iraq. And that's, you could say, the Africa Corps' next order of business, to streak past the British and looking to have a clash with the Russians. You would have had, you could say, an impromptu Anglo-Soviet alliance trying to hang on to Iraq, with the Iraqis at some point undoubtedly breaking cover, doing a coup and joining the Germans. If they had been smart enough to keep their powder dry until that moment in time, if they hadn't rushed the coup parties. Remember that Iraq is actually a semi-independent country and they've got a small army and air force of their own, so they can wreak some mischief. So depending on them timing it just right.
My only sort of doubt about this is how do you build up your logistics here?
Yes.
I'm not quite sure you've got well, you might have captured quite a bit of sort of merchant shipping, but there's not a lot of merchant shipping available to you. Cyprus might be a bit of a problem, actually, sticking there in the throat of the Middle East. If that is reinforced, you might be able to do some damage. But I wonder how much you can build up combat power. A lot of it will be aviation, I think, Klaus. I think the Luftwaffe would have been diverted.
You're going
to deal with this.
Once the Germans are in possession of northern Egypt, you're going to struggle to get any reinforcements to a place like Cyprus. The most viable route is via the Persian Gulf, possibly up the Tigris, and then over road or via an airlift, but via an airlift into Cyprus. You will no longer be in a position to deliver a military merchandise in bulk, which you could do as long as you still had the Red Sea and the Suez Canal.
I mean, it's a long way round.
Exactly.
But so I think what you would see is probably India and the empire in the east doing a lot of the supplying here, to tell you the truth. So you would see a lot of the weight of effort coming from the Indo-Pacific rather than through European theatre.
We're going to get into some of the more deeper counterfactuals just 1 second. This whole area here, it's not, from a resources perspective, it's not as... A lot of the oil at this point doesn't actually come from this region anyway, does it?
Well, we've got to remember that the Anglo-Iranian oil company has been set up in the 1930s. Oddly enough, there's quite a lot of German engineers in Iran. at this stage. So it's quite an interesting footprint in Iran. There is oil coming out of Iran.
There is oil, but like we see today with the Strait of Hormuz, it's not the powerhouse that we see today.
No, but a lot of the oil for the Royal Navy, for example, operating out of India comes from Iran, and it is processed as well. So it is producing quite a bit at this stage. The real prize, of course, is up here in the Caucasus, and the Germans have that on their radar. There's no question about that.
OK, that's the real history behind the Nazis' decision not to push south to the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, time to ask ourselves some really long-term questions. Had the Germans pursued the Mediterranean strategy during World War II? Starting with Chris, what are the best options for the Germans?
Well, I think we've got to realise that we've got a maximum of 2 divisions, a supporting air corps that's arrived in Egypt at this stage. You're going to have to be quite careful initially that you consolidate and you actually understand what is going on here. This is not familiar territory for the German armed forces. But you've then got to start thinking, how does this work with our overall strategy? We know that Hitler's planning Barbarossa. This looks like a very interesting flanking manoeuvre, which worse will distract the Soviets, but could actually be another front in case Barbarossa stalls, as of course it did. So you might actually be saying, look, right now, we'll just explore our way towards the Caucasus, not too aggressively because the Soviets might notice, but let's start developing this as a base for future operations that we might need. And I think that initially is the best option. Bring the Italians in. Italians are quite used to this end of the Mediterranean in trading terms. And we start developing this as a major hub, if you like, for future operations.
And so, as we mentioned earlier, so once they get past Egypt, are they not going to be met with that much resistance here?
Not really. No. I mean, you've got, again, you've got the French in Syria. You're going to have an agreement that, obviously, both sides need to have their interests safeguarded. I would think the French are looking on saying, well, it happened to us. We're glad it's happened to the British now. I'm afraid there's a bit of schadenfreude involved in this. I would think the Germans are sitting here saying, right, we've got all sorts of options. We can either go down to the Gulf. That would really mess things up, but that's difficult territory again. Transport, big issue. Is it air? Is it merchant marine? As I said, I would have hoped if I were the German naval staff, we would have cleared the Mediterranean of the Royal Navy by this stage.
And Klaus, all those options Chris talks about, are we saying in any eventuality we see Barbarossa in some form or the other?
Yes, almost certainly. If anything, I'd say this is a further enticement to go ahead. I'm not entirely convinced that Barbarossa was exclusively driven by ideology, but it was always there in the background. It was always the fallback position. It was always but surely you realize, Admiral, sooner or later we will need to have it out with the Soviets, etc., etc., etc. And the other arguments, such as strategy, economics, are, shall we say, arranged around it. And I'm convinced that Barbarossa would have been initiated regardless. This back on September 26th, when Raeder has this particular interview with Hitler, where he makes the case, actually quite forcefully, for a Mediterranean strategy. He hints very gently at the fact that, well, surely if we're sitting here, then this would be so threatening to the Soviets, it would deter them from any shenanigans, and we frankly don't need to invade and occupy them.
I think there's another issue as well. If you're the German General Staff now, you know that one of the prime objectives is to get to the Donetsk and to the oil of the Caucasus. And I just wonder if the whole southern thrust of Barbarossa disappears in this scenario, and you say, actually, we'll go for Leningrad and Moscow. We won't go for the Donetsk because we've got the option of coming up here. So you actually put your 170 divisions in the centre and the north, and again, you don't threaten the Donetsk because you can actually take the option of going through here.
And
A lot would depend on how far in you
Indeed,
already
yeah,
were.
yeah.
But I can see I can see why that makes sense.
And then you can put 80 plus divisions in both army groups, and the effect on that would have been pulverising.
But of course, what actually happened in Barbarossa, we know, they were overstretched, lack of resources. Are we saying in this timeline, because we've secured top of North Africa down here, you don't get that problem? Because then you're overstretching yourself even more.
You're still overstretched.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things we've discussed many times on this programme is the fact that somehow German generals seem to think they can impose their will on maps.
So we certainly try to.
You've just got to look at a place and we've got it already, and so there's a bit of a problem with that. So, no, I'd still think if it's in its current form, Barbarossa, you're going to be overstretched. Yeah. But we've got to remember the original plan for Barbarossa was a double encirclement going through the Baltics to Leningrad and south to the Donetsk, then coming and converging on Moscow. Well, I think that if this would have happened, you'd have had to reassess your basically three-thrust approach to Barbarossa and say, right, within the overall context, and my preference, thinking of it in the broad now, is you actually say, we've got an option later for these oil fields. In fact, we've got two options. Yeah. So let's concentrate on Army Group Centre, Army Group North, finish them off. And
do the Soviets, Klaus, did they, if, as Christian said, this comes to pass, do the Soviets have a plan for if Germany decide to come south through the Caucasus and the oil fields?
That is a big question. Let's face it, they had all kinds of plans pre-June 22nd, and they were all shelved because Stalin kept telling his admirals and generals, for heaven's sake, don't you do anything that might just perhaps upset the Germans. So any plans you might have ready and good to go, are just an irrelevance. But the thing is, the distances involved here are so small that I'd say, they did have a reasonably substantial force here, simply because it was a border, okay?
Yep.
And I'm convinced that a week or two into Barbarossa, this force would have received orders to begin crossing into Iran. Probably not Turkey. And somewhere along the line, they would have run into the Germans somewhere north of Baghdad.
Yeah.
If what we've seen from the record of the fighting in Europe is anything to go by, this force undoubtedly would have been A, outnumbered, but B, also successful. And that, of course, leads us to the bigger question, how much time before you get to Baku? And Baku is where in 1941, 75% of the Soviet Union's fuel oil is pumped.
Yeah.
That is huge.
So is that a complete game changer
for
the outcome of the war?
It's a war winner, I think, on the Barbarossa front. I think, Raeder at this point is saying, look, I need some coastline here in the Black Sea. So let's get up there, because then we got the Black Sea. We can get across to Romania and Bulgaria and things like that. We can bypass the Turks. By this stage, the Turks are feeling pretty vulnerable, I would think. And given what they did during the Second World War, they always tend to veer towards who's winning at any particular time. So they actually declared war on Germany in February 1945, when it was quite clear that Germany was losing. So at this stage, it's quite interesting. The other issue, of course, is if the timing is wrong here and the Germans frighten the Soviets too early, the Soviets are going to flood troops down here.
Well, yeah, exactly.
And it starts going the other way. And you end up with the Russians on the Mediterranean coast.
I don't see that.
I don't. But you've got a situation where the Russians will definitely push out, as Klaus said. And how does that look later on when the Russians win on the east?
And you do not want to be fighting a defensive war in here.
No, well, any sort of war, it's a horrible place.
It's just that if you literally have the Afrika Korps or even Panzerarmee Afrika, as it might well have been by then, occupying Baku, then I literally don't see the Soviet Union winning this one. I really don't.
Yeah,
the entire war.
Oh, yeah.
The entire war.
Game over.
It's literally game over.
Yeah. Because you're not getting your fuel oil. You're not getting any supplies up through here, which was the route through which it came, Lend-Lease came. And if you've struck with 2 army groups instead of 3 army groups, you've probably taken Murmansk and Archangel as well by that stage. So it's not coming in anywhere except through Vladivostok in the east. And of course, that's massive transit distances.
OK, that's a huge counterfactual where we're talking about Baku. If we don't see in that scenario the Soviet Union winning the war, but I mean, presumably that means, do we see the Germans winning the war? Or what then happens with the rest of the Allies and the US? We're really, really expanding things out now.
Now we're off to the races.
But if the Soviet Union begins falling...
We'll bring in Japan. Now, we know Japan wasn't going to attack the Soviet Union. Richard Sorge reassured Stalin that wasn't going to happen around the time of Barbarossa. We know that the troops were rushed from the east to support the armies that were trying to hold off Barbarossa. But Japan has its ambitions. And there's no doubt, while the United States is really squeezing Japan, it will take its opportunity. There's no question about that. And so Japan will enter the war at a time and place of its choice. And of course, I suspect in this circumstance, we're still going to see a German declaration of war against the United States because it's coming anyway.
Japan would enter the war, but as we've covered on a previous episode of History Undone, if the Soviet Union is far weaker down here, do Japan invade Siberia?
It's
the Soviet Union?
A very important point you just raised there. There is a substantial faction in the Japanese armed forces, well, mostly army, that is still eyeing Manchuria, Mongolia, and they, until about August 41, well, September 41 really, they've deliberately left the door open to the strategic option of maybe leaving the Western powers alone and making a move on the Soviet Union. Now, in our scenario, by August, September 1941, this would have become evident that the Soviet Union is likely as not crippled. Would the Soviet Union have comprehensively imploded? I don't see that happening in 41 because they still have some reasonably, shall we say, plentiful oil fields in Central Asia and the Urals. But it really would have considerably cramped their style of war making. And keep in mind, these are vast distances which are being covered, and the Red Army's way of war just involves tens of thousands of vehicles, vehicles that need fuel. So I can easily see them somehow grinding to a halt at some point in spring or summer of 42, maybe reduced to defending, Western and Central Siberia.
So what does that? So it's not a surrender as such, but what does that look like?
Well, I think they go for terms. I mean, I think as we know, towards the end of 1941, they were thinking of evacuating Moscow and also looking for a ceasefire at that stage. So things were pretty desperate. I think in this situation where the Germans really think about this and say, well, actually, we're going to flood troops down here. We're going to get into the Caucasus. We're going to get the oil from here because you get it for ourselves and also we deny it to the Soviets. And you've got 2 big army groups smashing into the centre and north of Moscow. You're looking for a way out. I think you're seeing the government move east at that point. If the Japanese start in the east at the same time, you're into dismemberment, I think.
I'm glad you mentioned that because there is, away from this, in 1942, I think, there's another plan called Operation Orient, which kind of involves, if they follow through this, linking up with Japan, pushing in from the west. I know, Chris, you said absolutely not. The Germans do not want that.
Fergus, everything the Germans say is about keeping the Japanese away, not only from some of the imperial possessions, but also keeping them away from their sphere of interest here. There's a lot of racial slurs about the Yellow Peril and all that sort of thing. They do not want to mix it. They want cooperation, and also in the Indian Ocean too, with Japanese submarines and surface ships, but they don't want the Japanese involved in anything that Germany is interested in.
They might not want it, Klaus, but would it be an at all effective strategy?
There is some indication to suggest that Hitler, by the second half of December 41, realized that he had boxed himself in. That he boxed himself in, that he had grotesquely miscalculated with his timing of the declaration of war on the US, that the Soviets appeared to be going from strength to strength, and that he was actually quite desperate for a plan B. I would say that by the spring, summer 42, if there had been a realistic chance of linking up with the Japanese somewhere around here, then frankly, he would have taken it and devil take the hindmost as far as the purity of National Socialist ideology was concerned. The problem is that as far as 1942 is concerned, I don't see any plausible counterfactuals. I mean, 1941, you've got this unique constellation, especially around May into June, that the British are doing you the favor of having dispersed the cream of their force to fight in Greece. Then they're still busy down there fighting the Italians in Abyssinia. And by the way, they still need to keep a wary eye on the Iraqis, who are not quite done with, you could say, their shenanigans. And you've got more than 30,000 Vichy French servicemen in Lebanon and Syria. And all of these factors lead to a unique dispersal of British Empire assets just as the 2nd German Division is coming into Libya. And if Mr. Rommel had just kept his powder dry till mid-May, that gives you this unique opportunity to rush into the Nile Delta while the British are still defending Crete. And such an opportunity will not occur again. From post-June 1941, whatever statistic you look at, whether it's sheer numbers of men in the field, numbers of howitzers, numbers of trucks or tanks available, the British Empire forces just run away from the Axis.
And so in this scenario, just briefly, Chris, as Klaus has just mentioned, what are the British doing here? I mean, I started in this episode by saying at the end of 1940, the Battle of Britain has failed. But in this scenario, they're losing a lot of territory here.
Well, I mean, you've got to look at what is actually strategically hitting them. Their route to the east is clobbered. I mean, I think the only real way the Japanese interfere on Germany's behalf, if they go continental, I think India's a bit of a sideshow by this stage because Britain's all cut off. I think Britain is starting to think, well, what have we got left? We've got Canada, we've got the Far East, and of course the Japanese are about to attack that. One whimsical thing struck me, of course, is if the Third Reich does get here, they'll be able to get hold of Harrison Ford's Lost Ark, because it's at Petra, of course, in Jordan. So maybe that'll help along the way. But no, I think at this stage, the British are saying we're rapidly losing, our footprint. Quite a lot of what we're trying to do to support India and our colonies in the Far East is just about to fall apart, to tell you the truth. And at that point, you say, OK, we've lost this. We've really got to think about Japan now.
Just final thought from you then, Klaus. Yeah, you've written a fantastic book called Hitler's Fatal Miscalculation. We've covered it on the show before, a little plug for you there. And that's about Germany's decision to declare war on the US, right? OK, well, in everything we've just described, in this scenario, we're saying if perhaps they took Baku, I mean, it could mean the Soviets lost the war. Is this Hitler's fatal miscalculation not to listen to Raeder and follow through with this plan?
Leaving aside Dunkirk, this is the only opportunity I see. And let's face it, we're talking about a window of opportunity that was fairly narrow in size, OK, and it slammed shut at some point in July of 1941. But this is the only window of opportunity that I can see, with the exception of Dunkirk, of the Third Reich actually walking away from this with a clear military victory. I know that people get over-fixated on the Battle of Britain, not to belittle the achievements of fighter command, but the Luftwaffe could have won the Battle of Britain, and the invasion would still not have happened.
Yeah, exactly.
Because Admiral Parry's buddies would have found a way of getting into the way.
They're my dad's buddies, actually.
Absolutely fascinating. So it's a big if, but we are saying potentially, if Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany had followed through with their Mediterranean plan, pushed through North Africa into the Middle East. They could have got to the Caucasus.
If they'd have changed their Barbarossa plan.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They could have got to the Caucasus. They could have taken Baku. If they take Baku, does that mean that the Soviet Union have lost the war? What happens then? Do they come to terms? What happens with Japan? Do they declare war on America? Do they invade the Soviet Union to the Far East? And where does that leave Britain? Broken and its empire severely damaged. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for today. My thanks to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry and Dr. Klaus Schmider for joining me. We'll be back undoing more history very soon. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. And you can also listen and follow the show as a podcast. Just search for History Undone in your podcast apps, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.